The fastest way to learn who truly holds the power in a room is to watch what happens after someone dares to say no. The first thing I remember was the sound. Not the crystal glasses clinking together. Not the soft piano drifting through the dining room. It was the silence that swallowed every conversation the instant my palm met his face. It lasted maybe 2 seconds. Long enough for my heartbeat to become the loudest thing I could hear. My name is Claire Bennett, and until that Friday night, I was just another waitress working double shifts at Bellamy House, the most exclusive restaurant in downtown Chicago. 24 years old, white apron tied a little too tight around my waist, student loans waiting in my mailbox, and a mother whose medical bills kept me picking up every extra shift I could find. I had spent months reminding myself that difficult customers came with the job. Smile. Apologize. Walk away. It was easier than arguing with people who thought money could buy kindness. That evening the restaurant glittered beneath warm chandeliers while rain painted silver streaks across the floor-to-ceiling windows. Expensive perfume mixed with the smell of perfectly grilled steaks and fresh rosemary. Men in tailored suits laughed over $1,000 bottles of wine while women in elegant dresses admired the skyline beyond the glass. Everyone looked comfortable except the staff. We floated from table to table like invisible ghosts. Then he walked in. Damien Moretti. I didn't know his name yet, but everyone else did. The hostess straightened so quickly she nearly dropped her reservation book. Managers who never left their office suddenly appeared near the entrance. Even the musician seemed to play a little softer. He wore a charcoal suit without a single wrinkle, no tie. The top button of his white shirt opened just enough to make him look effortless instead of careless. His dark hair was neatly combed back, his blue eyes calm, unreadable. 4 men followed him, not close enough to crowd him, not far enough to leave him alone. They never looked around nervously. They didn't need to. The room adjusted itself around them. Table 12 became my responsibility. Lucky me. I carried a tray with sparkling water and fresh bread, reminding myself that no guest was different from another. A customer was a customer. At least that was what I believed until I reached his table. One of the men beside him brushed past me without warning. The tray tilted. A glass slipped. Ice water splashed across Damien's jacket before crashing harmlessly onto the polished floor. My stomach dropped. "I'm so sorry," I said immediately, grabbing a clean linen napkin. "It was an accident." Before I could reach the table, another man stepped between us. "Don't touch him," he said quietly. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried enough weight to freeze my feet. Every nearby conversation faded. I lowered the napkin slowly. Damien looked down at the water soaking the sleeve of his jacket. His expression never changed. Then he looked at me. Calm. Cold. Patient. "Do you always ruin expensive things?" he asked evenly, "or is tonight a special occasion?" A few people nearby laughed. Not because the joke was funny. Because nobody wanted to disappoint the most powerful man in the room. He rushed into my face. I had spent my entire life swallowing insults from people who believed a uniform made someone less human. I thought about my mother sitting alone in a hospital room. I thought about my second job waiting tomorrow morning. I thought about every customer who had mistaken politeness for weakness. Something inside me finally refused to stay quiet. Before my mind could stop me, my hand moved. The sharp sound echoed across the dining room. His head turned slightly with the impact. Every fork stopped moving. Every chair became perfectly still. I stared into his blue eyes, suddenly realizing what I had done. And for the first time that night, I understood that the silence was far more terrifying than any shout could ever be. No one moved. I expected shouting. I expected security to drag me outside before I could even breathe again. Instead, the silence stretched across the dining room until it felt heavier than the marble beneath my shoes. Damien Moretti slowly turned his head back toward me. A faint pink mark rested against his cheek, but there was no anger in his expression. That frightened me more than rage ever could. His blue eyes studied my face as though he had forgotten everyone else existed. Around us, I noticed the smallest details because my mind had nowhere else to hide. A woman halfway through lifting a wine glass had frozen with it inches from her lips. The violinist held his bow perfectly still. Even the kitchen doors remained closed, as though the entire restaurant had stopped breathing together. One of the men standing behind Damien took a careful step forward. His jaw tightened, and his hand lifted slightly as if waiting for permission to intervene. Damien raised one finger without taking his eyes off me. The man stopped instantly. No words. No argument. Just complete obedience. I realized then that authority did not always sound loud. Sometimes it looked like absolute silence. My manager hurried across the dining room, nearly slipping on the water that still shimmered across the polished floor. His face had lost every bit of color. "Mr. Moretti," he said, his voice shaking, "I sincerely apologize. She is new. She does not understand." I opened my mouth. "I am not new," I said quietly. My manager looked at me with absolute disbelief, silently begging me to stop talking before I somehow made everything worse. Damien finally spoke. "What is your name?" His voice remained calm, almost conversational. I swallowed. Every instinct told me not to answer, but another part of me refused to look away. "Claire Bennett." He repeated my name once, slowly enough that it sounded less like a question and more like something he intended to remember. "Claire Bennett." Then, to everyone's surprise, he reached for the white linen napkin lying untouched beside his plate. He calmly dried the sleeve of his jacket himself before folding the cloth with perfect precision and placing it back on the table. "The meal is over," he said to the men beside him. They looked confused. So did everyone else. One of them leaned closer. "So?" Damien stood, adjusted the front of his jacket, and glanced toward my manager instead of me. "Pay the full bill," he said. "Include a generous tip for the staff." The manager blinked twice as though he had misunderstood. "Of course, sir." Damien nodded once before turning toward the entrance. His security team immediately fell into formation around him. Guests stepped aside without being asked. As he walked past me, he paused for barely a second. "Miss Bennett," he said quietly, "I hope the next person who earns your respect values it more carefully." Then he continued walking without another glance. The front doors opened. Cool rain drifted in from outside before closing behind him. The moment he disappeared, the restaurant erupted into whispers. Every table suddenly had an opinion. Every phone seemed to appear from every pocket. My manager spun toward me with wide eyes full of panic. "Claire," he whispered, "do you have any idea who that man was?" I slowly shook my head. My hands had finally begun to tremble. Somewhere deep inside, I realized that whatever had just happened was not finished. It had only begun. The restaurant manager fired me before midnight. He did not yell because he was too frightened to waste energy on anger. His hand shook as he placed my final paycheck into a plain white envelope. He apologized at least 6 times, but none of the words reached me. I simply untied my apron, folded it carefully, and placed it on the desk between us. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, leaving the streets glossy beneath the yellow glow of streetlights. Chicago always looked cleaner after a storm, as though the city could wash away everything except regret. I pulled my jacket tighter around my shoulders and started walking toward the subway station. I could not afford a ride home anymore. Every dollar mattered. My phone buzzed before I reached the corner. It was the hospital. My mother wanted to know whether I would still be able to visit tomorrow morning before my second job. I smiled even though she could not see me. Of course, I lied. "Everything is fine." She believed me because mothers always wanted to believe their children were stronger than they really were. When the call ended, I stared at the dark screen for several seconds. I had just lost the best-paying job I had ever found, yet somehow the thing that frightened me most was telling my mother the truth. Across the city, inside an office overlooking the Chicago River, Damien Moretti stood in front of floor-to-ceiling windows while the skyline reflected across the glass. He had changed into another jacket, but the faint outline of the water stain still rested in his memory far more clearly than it ever had on the fabric. One of his associates placed a thin folder onto the polished desk. "Her name is Claire Bennett," he said. 24 years old. Lives on the north side with her mother. Works 2 jobs. Community college business program. No criminal record. No lawsuits. No debt beyond student loans and medical expenses for her family. Damien did not answer immediately. He opened the folder himself instead of asking for a summary. Inside were ordinary photographs. Claire leaving a grocery store carrying discount bags. Claire waiting for a city bus in winter. Claire pushing her mother's wheelchair through a hospital entrance. None of them looked staged. None of them looked impressive. That was exactly what caught his attention. "Keep going," Damien said quietly. Another page revealed volunteer hours at a neighborhood food pantry every other Saturday. A recommendation letter from a former employer described her as stubborn, honest, and incapable of accepting favors she had not earned. One of the men allowed himself a small laugh. "She probably has no idea who you are." Damien finally looked up. "That is not the interesting part." The room became silent. "The interesting part," he continued, "is that she believed I was simply another rude customer." He closed the folder gently. "Everyone else in that restaurant reacted to my reputation. She reacted to my behavior. Nobody answered because nobody had ever heard him speak that way before." Damien walked back toward the windows. Far below, headlights moved through the streets like rivers of white light. "Do not contact her," he said. "Do not threaten her. Do not offer her money." One of the associates frowned. "Then why investigate?" Damien watched the city without turning around. "Because I have spent years surrounded by people who tell me exactly what they think I want to hear." He paused before speaking again. "Tonight, I met someone who did not. Hundreds of miles of street separated us that night, yet neither of us slept. I believed I had just destroyed my future." Damien Moretti had begun asking himself a question that nobody in his world had dared ask in years. What kind of woman valued her dignity more than her own safety? 3 days passed, and nothing happened. That was somehow worse than anything I had imagined. Every time I left my apartment, I caught myself looking over my shoulder. Every unfamiliar car made me nervous. Every stranger wearing a dark suit made my heart skip a beat. Yet life refused to pause simply because fear had moved in beside me. Hospital visits still came first. My mother smiled every morning with the same quiet optimism that had carried our family through years of hardship. She asked about work, and I answered with careful half-truths. I told her I was looking for new opportunities. I did not tell her that I had filled out 14 applications in 48 hours. I did not tell her that every rejection email felt heavier than the last. On Thursday afternoon, I found a plain white envelope tucked beneath the windshield wiper of my aging Honda. There was no stamp. No name on the outside. My pulse quickened as I looked around the nearly empty parking lot. Inside was a single business card printed on thick ivory paper. There was no company logo. Only one name. Damien Moretti. Below it was a phone number embossed in silver lettering. Nothing else. No message. No demand. No explanation. I stared at it for nearly a full minute before walking straight to the nearest trash can and dropping it inside. The card landed beside an empty coffee cup. I turned around without looking back. If he wanted gratitude, he would not get it. If he wanted fear, he had chosen the wrong woman. Across the city, Damien sat inside a quiet conference room while several executives discussed a multi-million-dollar real estate project. Numbers filled the screen behind them, but his attention drifted elsewhere when his phone vibrated once. One of his associates spoke softly. She threw away the card within 2 minutes. A faint smile almost reached Damien's face before disappearing again. Did anyone approach her? No. Did anyone pressure her? No. Damien nodded once. Good. The meeting continued, but one executive finally gathered enough courage to ask the question everyone else had been thinking. Sir, if you want her to work for one of the companies, we can simply make the offer impossible to refuse. Damien looked toward him with calm blue eyes. That would tell me nothing. The room became silent. People reveal their character only when they believe they are completely free to choose. Later that evening, I interviewed for a waitress position at a small family-owned cafe on the north side. The owner, Mrs. Patterson, wore flour on her apron and kindness in her eyes. She apologized because the pay was lower than my previous job, but she promised flexible hours so I could continue visiting my mother. I accepted before she finished explaining the schedule. Honest work was still honest work. As I tied on another apron, one far simpler than the elegant uniform I had once worn, I felt something inside me settle. Pride did not pay bills, but neither did resentment. The lunch rush arrived the following day with tired office workers and neighborhood regulars who knew each other's names. It felt ordinary. Safe. Then, just before noon, the front door opened. Every conversation continued. No one recognized the man who stepped inside except me. Damien Moretti stood alone this time. No security. No expensive entourage. Just a charcoal overcoat and the same unreadable blue eyes that quietly found mine across the crowded cafe. Without saying a single word, he chose the smallest table near the window and waited for someone to take his order. For a moment I wondered if I had imagined him. The little neighborhood cafe smelled of fresh bread and cinnamon instead of imported wine and polished marble. Parents chatted over coffee while construction workers laughed near the counter. It was the kind of place where everyone thanked the waitress before leaving. Damien Moretti looked strangely out of place sitting beside the rain-speckled window, yet somehow the entire room still seemed to bend around his quiet presence. He did not wear the confidence of a man trying to impress anyone. He simply waited. Mrs. Patterson smiled at me from behind the register. Claire, table 7 is yours. I picked up a menu and walked toward him, reminding myself that he was just another customer. Nothing more. Nothing less. My hand stayed steady this time. Good afternoon, I said. Welcome to Patterson Cafe. Can I get you started with something to drink? He looked up from the menu with the same calm blue eyes I remembered. Coffee, he answered. Black. I wrote it down without another word. Would you like anything to eat? Whatever you recommend. That caught me off guard. Wealthy customers usually ordered the most expensive item without asking. The turkey sandwich is popular, I replied. And the homemade soup. He nodded once. Then I will trust your judgment. I walked away before he could say anything else. While pouring his coffee, I noticed he never reached for his phone. He never looked around the room. He simply watched people. An elderly couple sharing pie. A little girl coloring with crayons while her father read the newspaper. A college student studying with headphones around his neck. It was as if he had stepped into a world he rarely allowed himself to notice. When I brought his lunch, he thanked me. The words were quiet, almost unfamiliar on his tongue. I placed the plate in front of him. Is there anything else you need? Yes. I waited. An honest answer. I folded my hands behind my apron. About what? Do you regret what happened at the restaurant? I met his eyes without hesitation. I regret losing my job. He nodded slowly. But not the reason. No silence settled between us for several seconds. Finally he spoke again. Most people apologize when they believe it will benefit them. I have apologized for accidents, I answered. I have never apologized for respecting myself. Something almost invisible softened in his expression. Not a smile. More like recognition. Before he could respond, Mrs. Patterson called my name from across the cafe. The lunch rush had arrived. I excused myself and spent the next hour refilling coffee cups, clearing tables, and greeting regular customers. Damien never interrupted my work. When he finished eating, he walked to the register instead of leaving cash on the table. Mrs. Patterson handed him the receipt. He paid the bill and thanked her for the meal. Then she opened the check presenter and frowned. "Sir," she called after him. "You left far too much." Damien turned back calmly. "The service deserved it." Mrs. Patterson smiled kindly and held out the extra bills. "Not here, it does not. We accept fair payment. We do not accept mistakes." For the first time since I had met him, Damien actually smiled. It was brief, almost surprised, but real. He accepted the returned money without argument, thanked her once more, and walked out into the afternoon sunlight. I watched him disappear through the front window, convinced that strange encounter was finally over. I did not notice the dark sedan parked quietly across the street or the unfamiliar man inside watching the cafe with far more interest than any ordinary customer ever would. The rest of the afternoon passed more quietly than I expected, but I could not shake the feeling that unseen eyes had followed Damien out of the cafe. When my shift finally ended, Mrs. Patterson thanked me for staying late and handed me a small paper bag filled with leftover soup and fresh bread for my mother. I thanked her, tucked the warm bag beneath my arm, and stepped into the cool evening air. The neighborhood felt peaceful. Streetlights flickered on one by one while people hurried home carrying groceries or walking their dogs. It looked like an ordinary Thursday, yet something deep inside me refused to relax. As I crossed the street toward my car, I noticed the same dark sedan still parked half a block away. Its engine was running, but the headlights remained off. I could not see the driver's face through the windshield. I told myself I was imagining things. Chicago was full of parked cars. Not every shadow carried meaning. I unlocked my Honda, placed the food on the passenger seat, and started the engine. Before I could pull away, another vehicle quietly rolled into the parking lot and stopped several spaces away. It was a black SUV. Damien stepped out alone, wearing a dark overcoat instead of the tailored suit I had first seen him in. He closed the door without rushing and walked toward my driver's side window. Every sensible thought told me to drive away, but curiosity kept my hands frozen on the steering wheel. I lowered the window only a few inches. "Did you forget something?" I asked. He glanced briefly toward the dark sedan before looking back at me. "No, but then why are you here?" "Because someone has been watching this cafe since before lunch." A chill traveled down my spine. I fought to keep my voice steady. "How would you know that?" "Because they have also been watching me." I turned slightly toward the sedan. At that exact moment, its engine started, and the car pulled away from the curb without speeding or drawing attention. It simply disappeared into traffic. "Who are they?" I asked quietly. Damien shook his head once. "I do not know yet." "Then why tell me?" He rested one hand lightly on the edge of my open window. "Because there is a difference between fear and awareness. I would rather you have the second than suffer from the first." His answer caught me completely off guard. It was not a threat. It was not an order. It sounded almost like concern, and I did not know what to do with that. "You still think this has something to do with me?" I asked. "I think someone noticed that you crossed paths with me." He paused before continuing. "Sometimes that is enough to attract unwanted attention." I looked directly into his eyes. "If people are watching because of you, then staying away from me would solve the problem." A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Perhaps. Will you?" He held my gaze for several long seconds before answering honestly. "I do not know." There was no arrogance in his voice. Only uncertainty, as though he disliked the answer as much as I did. He stepped back from the window. "Drive carefully, Claire." Without waiting for a response, he returned to the SUV and left. I remained in the parking lot for another full minute, watching the taillights disappear into the evening traffic. For the first time since that night at the restaurant, I realized the greatest mystery was no longer why Damien Moretti had entered my life. It was why he seemed determined to keep danger away from it without asking for anything in return. The next week settled into a rhythm that almost convinced me life was becoming ordinary again. I worked mornings at the cafe, spent afternoons at the hospital with my mother, and studied late into the night after she fell asleep. Damien never called. He never sent flowers, gifts, or another business card. If our paths crossed, it was only by coincidence, or at least that was what I kept telling myself. Still, every now and then I caught sight of a familiar black SUV parked across the street from the hospital or waiting at a traffic light before quietly disappearing. It never followed too closely. It never interrupted my day. It simply existed on the edge of my awareness like a question that refused to answer itself. One rainy Saturday afternoon, I left the hospital carrying a small paper bag filled with my mother's favorite lemon cookies. She had insisted I take them home because the nurses had brought too many. I laughed to myself as I walked toward the parking garage, thinking how she still found ways to take care of me while lying in a hospital bed. That was when I noticed two unfamiliar men standing near my car. They wore ordinary jackets and baseball caps, blending into the crowd so well that most people would never have looked twice. One of them glanced toward me before quietly speaking into a phone. The second looked away the instant our eyes met. My step slowed. Nothing they did was illegal. Nothing looked threatening. Yet every instinct inside me whispered that something was wrong. I turned around naturally and walked back toward the hospital entrance instead of continuing to my car. A volunteer smiled as I passed through the automatic doors again. I pretended to check my phone while watching the parking lot through the glass. Less than a minute later, both men walked away without approaching my vehicle. My pulse refused to settle. Before I could decide whether I was overreacting, my phone vibrated. An unknown number appeared on the screen. I almost ignored it before answering. "Hello? You? Trusted your instincts." Damien's voice was calm. "Good." I froze. Were those men watching me? A brief silence followed. "They were asking questions about you." "Who are they?" "I am still finding out." I leaned against the wall, lowering my voice. "How did you know where I was?" "Because I asked someone to make sure no one followed you after the cafe." I closed my eyes for a moment. "You promised you would stay away." I said I did not know if I could. His honesty frustrated me because it left nothing to argue against. "Claire," he continued quietly, "if I wanted to control your life, you would know it. I only want you to have the chance to live it." Those words stayed with me long after the call ended. Later that evening, inside Damien's office, one of his most trusted associates placed another report on the desk. The questions about Miss Bennett came from people connected to Victor Sorrenti's organization. Damien's expression hardened for the first time in days. "They believe she matters to you," the associate continued. Damien looked toward the dark city beyond the windows. "They are wrong." The associate hesitated before asking, "Are they?" Damien did not answer. He simply watched the lights of Chicago shimmer across the river, knowing that the greatest danger had never been someone discovering who Claire Bennett was. It was the possibility that, somewhere deep inside himself, he had already begun to care enough to prove them right. After that phone call, I stopped telling myself that everything was a coincidence. I became more observant instead of more afraid. I noticed unfamiliar faces lingering a little too long outside the hospital entrance. I noticed the same gray sedan parked on different streets during the week. None of it proved anything, yet every small detail fit together like pieces of a puzzle that refused to reveal the full picture. Even so, life continued. My mother improved enough to begin physical therapy, and watching her take a few determined steps with a walker filled me with more hope than I had felt in months. She smiled through the effort and squeezed my hand afterward. "You look tired, sweetheart," she whispered. "Promise me. You are still living your own life." I smiled back. I am trying. She studied my face for a moment. Someone has changed the way you look at the world. I laughed softly because I could not explain it myself. Maybe the world changed first. 2 evenings later, I finished my shift at the cafe just before sunset. Mrs. Patterson handed me a small bouquet of daisies that had been left over from a catering order. "Take these to your mother tomorrow," she said. "Hospitals always need more flowers." I thanked her and stepped outside carrying the bouquet. As I walked toward my car, I heard someone call my name. "Claire." I turned to see Damien standing beside the sidewalk without a single bodyguard in sight. The city moved around him without realizing who he was. Cars passed. People walked their dogs. A bicyclist rang a bell while crossing the intersection. For the first time, he looked less like an untouchable figure and more like an ordinary man standing beneath the fading evening sky. "How did you know I would be here?" I asked. "I did not," he admitted. "I hoped." His answer caught me by surprise. Hope was not a word I expected from him. We walked slowly along the block without deciding to. Neither of us hurried to fill the silence. Finally, I asked the question that had been growing inside me for days. "Why are you really doing this?" He looked ahead instead of at me. "Because I spent years believing respect came from power." He paused. "Then someone reminded me there is a difference." "By slapping you?" A quiet laugh escaped him. "No. By refusing to surrender your dignity afterward." We stopped beside a small neighborhood park where children chased each other across the grass while parents watched from nearby benches. Damien observed them with thoughtful eyes. "Do you know what nobody has asked me since that night?" he said. I shook my head. "Whether I deserved it." His words settled heavily between us. I looked at him carefully before answering. "Did you?" He did not defend himself. He did not make excuses. After several long seconds he nodded once. "Yes." That single word changed something inside me. It was the first genuine apology I had ever heard from a man. Powerful enough to avoid giving one. Before I could respond, his phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen, and the warmth disappeared from his expression. He slipped the phone back into his pocket. "I have to leave." "Is something wrong?" "Someone made a decision tonight," he answered quietly. "I only hope it was not too late." Without another explanation, he turned and walked toward the waiting black SUV at the end of the street. I watched him drive away, unaware that across the city another conversation had already begun, and this time my name was no longer spoken with curiosity. It was being spoken as part of someone else's plan. 6 months passed before I fully understood what had really happened that rainy night inside the restaurant. Life had not become perfect, but it had become honest again. My mother finished her rehabilitation and walked out of the hospital without needing a wheelchair. Mrs. Patterson surprised me by asking whether I wanted to become a partner instead of an employee after I completed my business classes. Together we expanded the little neighborhood cafe into a second location across town. We served homemade food, remembered customers by name, and treated every person who walked through the door with the same respect, whether they arrived in work boots or an expensive suit. One quiet afternoon, Mrs. Patterson handed me a newspaper. The headline covered nearly half the front page. Damien Moretti had announced the creation of a charitable foundation dedicated to funding neighborhood businesses, trade schools, and medical recovery programs. More surprising than the announcement itself was the interview beneath it. When a reporter asked why he had changed the direction of his companies, he answered with only one sentence. "Power should create opportunities, not fear." I read those words 3 times before setting the paper aside. A week later, I received an invitation to the foundation's opening ceremony. I almost declined, but my mother smiled when she saw the envelope. "Some chapters deserve a proper ending," she said. The event took place in a restored community center instead of a luxury hotel. Children played basketball in the gym, while local families explored classrooms that had been renovated with new equipment. Teachers, nurses, firefighters, and small business owners filled the audience. Damien stood on the stage wearing a simple navy suit with no dramatic entrance and no visible security surrounding him. He looked older somehow, not in years but in understanding. During his speech he thanked volunteers, construction workers, and community leaders before unexpectedly stepping away from the podium. His eyes found mine in the crowd. The room grew quiet. He walked directly toward me until only a few feet separated us. Every camera turned in our direction. I remembered the silence from the restaurant months earlier, but this one felt completely different. Damien looked at me with the same calm blue eyes that no longer seemed distant. "Miss Bennett," he said clearly enough for everyone to hear, "months ago I met someone who reminded me that respect cannot be purchased, demanded, or inherited. It can only be earned." Then, to the astonishment of everyone watching, he offered a sincere apology. "I judged your worth by your uniform instead of your character. I was wrong, and I am grateful you refused to let me believe I was right." There was no performance in his voice. No pride left to protect. Only honesty. I smiled because that was all the moment needed. "Apology accepted," I answered quietly. The audience applauded, but I barely heard them. What mattered was not that the most powerful man in the city had apologized in public. What mattered was that he had become the kind of man who believed an apology was worth giving. Years later people still told the story of the waitress who slapped a powerful businessman in front of a crowded restaurant. They always focused on the shocking beginning. I always remember the ending instead, because the loudest sound that changed both of our lives was never the slap itself. It was the quiet moment when pride stepped aside and respect finally took its place.